In the year 922 AD, under a gray Russian sky, a girl stood trembling beside a funeral ship soaked in animal blood. She was barely 16. Her wrists were bruised, her eyes vacant, her breath thick with the stink of fermented honey and mushrooms. The air stank of burning flesh and incense. She wasn't mourning. She was the sacrifice. She wasn't just going to die. She was going to carry an army of men's lusts into the afterlife. For 10 days, Viking warriors, men with ash-covered beards and dead eyes, passed her from hand to hand. Not out of desire but ritual. Each one told her the same lie. Tell your master I did this out of love for him. They believed that by violating her body, they were transferring their essence to the dead chieftain, fuel for his soul to rise gloriously into Valhalla. When her knees buckled from exhaustion, they fed her more mead. When she screamed, they told her she was blessed. Then came the final day. She was dragged aboard the funeral ship, dazed and silent, and laid beside the chieftain's rotting corpse. An old woman they called the Angel of Death, part priestess, part executioner, took a cord, wrapped it around the girl's throat, and as 6 warriors held her down, she was strangled and stabbed at the same time. The crowd cheered. The ship was set ablaze. And the girl, drugged, broken, and used, was burned alive. This is not fiction. This is not myth. This is history. I witnessed, recorded, by a Muslim diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who could barely bring himself to describe what he saw. What you're about to hear is not for the faint of heart. These are the most horrific sexual practices of Viking raiders, rituals buried in sagas, bones, and blood. A culture where sexuality was not about pleasure or love. It was about power, humiliation, and conquest. This history was nearly lost, intentionally buried by scholars who feared what it revealed. But now it's time to dig it back up. Welcome to the History Scar. If you believe history shouldn't be censored, hit subscribe. Viking violence didn't end on the battlefield. In many ways it had only just begun. For the Norse raiders, conquest wasn't complete until it was carved into the bodies of the defeated, not with swords but with shame. To truly dominate an enemy, the Vikings believed you had to do more than kill him. You had to erase his manhood, shatter his spirit, and send him back to his people as a walking warning. This is what happens when you resist. This is where Viking warfare crossed into a realm far darker than death. They had a word for it, klumhog, or what the sagas call the shame stroke. It was no random act of cruelty. It was symbolic sexual mutilation, carried out with surgical humiliation. After a warrior was defeated, he might be stripped naked and sliced across the buttocks in front of his own men, a crude but clear symbol of anal penetration. No one had to actually violate him. The cut was enough. Because in Viking society, just the implication that a man had been sexually passive was enough to destroy his life. There were 2 words that struck fear into the hearts of Norse men, vager and ragger. They weren't just insults. They were legal designations. A vager was a man who allowed himself to be sexually used by another. A ragger was worse. He was not just submissive but effeminate, considered unworthy of respect, of citizenship, even of life. Under Viking law, calling another man vager could legally justify murder. Yes, you could kill someone in public for accusing you of being sexually passive, and walk free. The Icelandic sagas are soaked in blood not just from war, but from sexual insult. In Egil's saga, a single jab at a man's masculinity led to multiple murders, revenge plots, and years of feuding. In the saga of Burnt and Jarl, one character dies not because of land or power, but because someone accused him of being unmanly. Honor wasn't about truth. It was about perception. And once that perception was shattered, you were done. To be on the receiving end of sexual violence wasn't just painful. It meant social erasure. A man marked as sexually conquered couldn't testify in court, inherit property, or even carry a sword. He lost his rights, his title, and his identity. His wife could leave him. His children might disown him. His entire bloodline tainted. Some chose suicide. Others wandered as ghosts, exiled by their own people, whispered about but never spoken to. And this is exactly how the Vikings wanted it. The Norse knew that a humiliated man could become more dangerous to his own society than an army ever could. He carried fear back with him like a plague. A virus of defeat, infection through disgrace. What if it happens to me next? That question, unspoken but heavy, kept entire villages in line. Because Viking rape wasn't about lust. It was about control. They didn't need to violate every man. Just enough to make an example. Just enough to make resistance feel like a worse fate than surrender. But the line wasn't about homosexuality. It was about dominance. Vikings were known to have same-sex relations, But the rule was clear. He who penetrates wins. He who submits dies. Some Viking warriors even kept male lovers alongside their wives, treating them as trophies of conquest. The act itself was not taboo, but the role within it defined your entire status in society. There are stories of chieftains who forced defeated enemies to serve as human footstools, to wear women's clothes, to live in the barn with animals. Not out of necessity but out of psychological warfare. And if a leader returned home having been violated in any way, even symbolically, his own clan would disown him. His children would no longer call him father. His name, forgotten. This wasn't savagery. It was a system. Codified in law. Sanctified by ritual. Perfected through centuries of cultural programming. To the Vikings, sex was not intimacy. It was a ranking system, a violent, carnal hierarchy where only the dominant survived. They are the filthiest of God's creatures, he wrote. With no regard for honor, for mercy, or for the sacredness of life. He wasn't being dramatic. He was recording what the rest of the world didn't want to admit. And now, neither can we. We dig into sources most won't touch. If you're still watching, you're one of the few who can stomach the truth. So don't just lurk, subscribe. Or at least tell us below what exactly is stopping you. Viking society didn't just judge men by how they fought in war. It judged them by how they performed in bed. And not in private, in public, in law, and in legacy. In the North, sex wasn't just an act. It was a legal transaction, a weapon, a test, and a battlefield all in one. Every thrust, every rumor, every accusation had the power to destroy lives, families, and reputations. The legal codes of medieval Iceland made that brutally clear. Being called vegur, a passive man, wasn't just shameful. It was punishable with death. And if you weren't aggressive enough in your own marriage, you could be dragged to court by your in-laws. That's not exaggeration. That's statute. Viking law tied a man's sexual dominance directly to his legal rights. A man found guilty of being sexually submissive could be stripped of citizenship. He would no longer be allowed to own land, carry weapons, inherit property, or testify in court. He wasn't just dishonored, he was legally erased. And that's just one side of it. In marriage, sexual performance was a contract. Failure to consummate the union could be grounds for annulment, financial restitution, or public disgrace. The bride's family had a right, an obligation, to witness or confirm that intercourse had occurred. If they couldn't, the marriage could be declared void, and the dowry returned like a faulty product. Imagine it, a new husband, nervous and unsteady, forced to perform while his bride's relatives waited outside the door, straining to hear evidence of penetration. In some cases, family members didn't even leave the room. They stayed. They watched. They testified. And the morning after? The couple didn't get breakfast in bed. They got their bedsheets inspected. Blood was the proof of virginity. A blood-stained sheet was considered legal evidence that the marriage had been successfully consummated. That sheet could later be brought to court in the event of a dispute. If the bride bled, she was untouched and valuable. If she didn't, her family might be sued for dowry fraud. No blood. No honor. No deal. But it didn't end there. Viking law had a catalog of punishments for sexual inadequacy. If a man failed to penetrate, he could be sued for breach of contract. If he failed to arouse his bride or was too gentle, the wife could divorce him with no penalty. Even being accused of wearing feminine clothing or behaving passively in bed could get a man exiled. Sex was not private. It was performative, transactional, and subject to public arbitration. And behind every law was a mechanism of control. The Viking obsession with sexual dominance created a self-reinforcing hierarchy. Men were terrified of being labeled weak, so they overcompensated with aggression. Wives could use the law to challenge their husbands, but they were also pressured to defend family honor through sexuality. Entire clans could rise or fall depending on a couple's performance on one night. The sagas are filled with stories of women divorcing men for failing to dominate them. One woman in Laxdæla saga publicly declared her husband unfit because he was too soft in bed. He lost not just his wife but his dignity. His name was smeared across generations of oral history. In Jarl's saga, another woman pushes her husband into a blood feud to prove he's still a man. The fight ends in death. But for her it was worth it. Better a dead man than a passive one. What this created was a culture where intimacy and violence were intertwined, not just culturally but legally. You didn't just marry someone, you signed a contract that your sexuality would live up to public expectations. If it didn't, you could be discarded, humiliated, or sued. Sex was used to measure a man's worth, to test his authority, to shame his enemies. to control his allies. It was law, spectacle, and punishment all at once. And for the Vikings that was the point. In their world, control wasn't maintained by armies or kings. It was enforced in bedrooms, weddings, and courtrooms, through the fear that your private failures could be made painfully, brutally public. This was a society where you didn't just sleep with your partner. You slept with your future, your freedom, and your name. And if you failed, you lost them all. That's not hyperbole. That's the law. To understand Viking power, you must follow the chains, not the ones they wore in battle but the ones they clamped around the necks of human beings. By the height of their expansion, the Vikings had built something few textbooks will ever call by name, a pan-European sexual trafficking empire. It stretched from the British Isles to the Baltic Sea, with hubs and places we now visit as tourist sites. Dublin. Had to be. Right. These weren't just trading posts for amber or furs. These were flesh markets, human warehouses where the bodies of enslaved men, women, and children were bought, sold, and exploited. At the heart of it all were Viking raiders who didn't just take wealth, they took people. And what they couldn't use for ransom or labor they used for pleasure. Archaeological digs across former Viking ports tell the story modern narratives try to forget. In Dublin, remains show a staggering 30% of the population may have been enslaved at one point in the 9th century. That's not conquest. That's infrastructure. These weren't nameless cargo. They were women ripped from monasteries in Lindisfarne, girls snatched from Irish villages, and captured noblewomen from Frankish territories. Once taken, they ceased to be human in the eyes of Viking law. Because here's the terrifying truth. Free Viking women had legal rights. Enslaved women had none. A free woman could own land, divorce a man for poor sexual performance, and even sue for unwanted advances. But a slave woman? She could be used sexually by any free man, and killed for resisting without consequence. Viking legal code stated plainly, raping a slave was considered a property violation, not a personal one. In the saga of the people of Laxardal, a captured woman is described not as a person but as part of the spoils to be divided. In Ingvar's saga, a group of raiders argue over which women to take home as breeding stock. These aren't embellishments. These are primary sources, stories told with the same detachment one might use for dividing livestock. In some sagas, leaders were even expected to take the finest captives for themselves. Earl Sigurd of Orkney, for example, was recorded as maintaining a harem of Irish women, rotating them in and out of his personal quarters like furnishings. The sagas describe it not as cruelty but as status. It was understood. It was accepted. It was law. Free men were judged by how many desirable captives they acquired. And in the most twisted parts of Viking culture, this became a source of entertainment. Accounts speak of festivals where new slaves were paraded before crowds, stripped and evaluated. Their appearance, youth, and submissiveness were bartered like spices. Some were auctioned publicly. Others were set aside for intimate training, taught to perform for their masters, with older slaves showing them how to survive. And those who didn't comply? They were disposed of quietly. Sites like Trelleborg and Oseberg tell their stories in bones. Shallow graves with female skeletons show signs of trauma, broken hips, cracked teeth, bound limbs. One girl, no older than 14, was buried in a mass pit with a wooden gag in her mouth. Not from disease. Not from battle. From resistance. In York, a skull was found, split at the temple with a collar ring still fused to the vertebrae. No grave goods. No ceremony. Just one more life used and discarded. These weren't the results of a few bad apples. This was a system, an industrialized machine that monetized human suffering. And it paid. Slavery became the backbone of Viking wealth. Ships left ports like Ribe filled with timber and iron and returned with bound humans, ready to be traded inland or held as domestic tools and sex objects. Some were sold to Muslim traders in the East. Others stayed in longhouses as unpaid labor, servants, and concubines. The economy was booming, and it ran on bodies. Even religion wasn't safe. Some captives were used in ritual sacrifices. Others were bred to create children who could be sold for profit, often separated from their mothers by the age of 5. These children were raised as tools, never taught their names or origins, and passed from household to household until their usefulness ran out. And this is the paradox. Because while the Vikings gave unprecedented rights to their free women, they built an empire that thrived on the absolute subjugation of others. The very freedom Viking women enjoyed was reinforced by a system that made other women utterly disposable. By granting rights to a few, Viking society gave power to justify the dehumanization of the many. It was a system of contrast, strength defined by someone else's weakness, freedom validated by someone else's chains. This is not the story told in Nordic tourist brochures. It's not in the schoolbooks or museum plaques beside Viking swords and silver hoards. But it's in the bones. It's in the graves. It's in the sagas, hidden beneath the poetry, waiting to be read clearly. They called it honor. They called it tradition. But what they built was a machine. A sexual economy that consumed the powerless and rewarded the ruthless. And its shadows still linger. In the Viking world, marriage wasn't just a union between two people. It was a contract between families, a transfer of wealth, property, and bloodline. And at the heart of this transaction was not love, but sex. Not just sex, but provable sex. There was no room for privacy in the Viking bedroom. In fact, it was often illegal. Because a marriage without proof of consummation could be annulled, and entire dowries lost. This was a society that treated intimacy like evidence, where sexual performance became a matter of public record. The ceremony itself was already soaked in symbolism. The bride would be handed a sword, often her father's, to signify the transfer of protection. The groom would place Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, on her lap as a blessing of fertility. These weren't metaphors. Everyone in the room understood their meaning. Strength, penetration, submission. But what came after was even more revealing. Following the wedding feast, the bride and groom were escorted, sometimes carried, into the bedchamber. But they did not go alone. They were followed by family members. In some cases, a priest or elder stayed in the room. Not as moral support but as a witness. Because without witnesses, there was no legal proof that the marriage had been sealed. In the saga of Grettir the Strong, there's a striking account of such a wedding. Grettir's cousin is married off to a wealthy merchant's daughter. The entire household gathers outside the room, waiting to hear the sounds of consummation. The bride's uncle, her own blood relative, remains inside to verify the act has taken place. The groom hesitates. Grettir, watching from the shadows, mocks him for being soft as butter. The next morning, the uncle proudly announces that the girl screamed rightly, and the blood on the sheets confirms her purity. That blood, expected, examined, and preserved, was more than symbolic. It was legally binding. In the eyes of the law, if no blood was found, the bride could be accused of falsehood. Her family could be sued for dowry fraud, and the groom could demand repayment. If the groom failed to perform, if he could not penetrate or was too gentle, the bride's family could seek compensation or even have the marriage dissolved. The Icelandic law codes didn't speak in poetic language. They laid it out plainly. Marital sex had to be immediate, observable, and effective. In Laxdæla saga, the story of Gernasvar's daughter illustrates just how central this ritual was. Gern, known for her sharp wit and unflinching honesty, divorces her first husband after publicly shaming him for being more wife than man. Her accusation? That he lacked the vigor expected of a husband in bed. The implication? That he had failed the marriage, not spiritually but legally. And the punishment for that failure was swift and public. Divorce, disgrace, and a stain on his reputation that would follow him through every hall in Iceland. Sex in Viking marriages wasn't a private confirmation of love. It was a performance of legitimacy. A man's ability to consummate the union proved not just his masculinity, but his competence. A woman's ability to bleed proved her worth and her family's honor. And the families were always watching. They didn't just witness the act, they blessed it. Before the couple entered the chamber, elders would anoint the bed with fertility prayers, words that bordered on erotic incantations. They weren't wishing the couple happiness. They were demanding proof. Afterward, the bloody sheets weren't discarded. They were folded, stored, and sometimes used in legal disputes. They became relics of contractual agreement, no different than a signed document or land deed. For the Vikings, the most intimate act two people could share wasn't sacred. It was scrutinized, judged, and archived. Failure to perform could unravel alliances. Rumors of sexual inadequacy could destroy reputations. Marriages were less about compatibility and more about execution, the execution of an expectation with legal consequences. And for the bride and groom, there was no escape from this system. Not in the bed. Not in the court. Not even in the memory of their wedding night. Because when your own uncle has to watch you prove your worth as a husband, privacy is no longer a right. It's a liability. And in the Viking world, liabilities didn't last long. In the year 922, a foreign ambassador from Baghdad stood horrified on the banks of the Volga River. His name was Ahmad ibn Fadlan, and what he witnessed would follow him like a shadow to his grave. Before him stood a Viking funeral ship, surrounded by fire, chanting, and celebration. A chieftain had died, and the Norsemen were sending him to the afterlife. But not alone. A slave girl had been chosen to accompany him, a girl who, just days before, had believed her life still belonged to her. Now she was being turned into a vessel of sex, a vessel of death, a vessel of power. The funeral began days before the pyre was lit. She was paraded through the camp, dressed in fine silk, adorned with jewelry she would never own. She was told she had been blessed, that she would join her master in the next world, that this was an honor. But behind the rituals, something far darker was unfolding. Each day leading up to the funeral, she was drugged with alcohol and herbs, sedated just enough to weaken her will but not numb her completely. She was then passed between Viking men, 6, sometimes more, each one laying with her, each one whispering into her ear, "Tell your master that I did this out of love for him." But love had nothing to do with it. This was about transference. The belief that sexual energy could carry strength into the afterlife. The Viking mind saw sex as more than pleasure, it was a form of spiritual alchemy. The slave girl was treated as a conduit, not a person. The more men she received, the more potent her body became as a ritual offering. On the final day, the ritual reached its climax. She was taken to the funeral ship and laid beside the chieftain's corpse. His flesh already stank of rot, but this mattered little. The girl was surrounded by elders, warriors, and one figure above all, the angel of death. She was not metaphor. She was real. An older woman, experienced in ritual killing. She had one task, to guide the girl to the next world. The crowd stood in reverent silence. And then, one by one, 6 more men entered the tent. Each had sex with the girl, symbolizing different powers: the sun, the hunt, the sea, the sword, the earth, and death itself. As they exited, the angel of death stepped forward. She wrapped a thick cord around the girl's neck. And as she pulled, another woman stabbed the girl in the ribs, ensuring the final moment of life was filled with pain, confusion, and submission. The tribe began chanting. The ship was set ablaze. And in that moment, fire consumed flesh and ritual consumed identity. Ahmad ibn Fadlan wrote of this event with clinical horror. He had seen beheadings, floggings, and battlefield executions. But nothing compared to this. The Norse had fused sex, death, and spirituality into a single act of cultural theater. One designed to elevate the dead and erase the living. For centuries, historians doubted his account. It was too grotesque, too extreme, too unbelievable. And then the graves began to speak. In 1904, archaeologists uncovered the Oseberg ship burial in Norway. 2 women buried in lavish style. One was clearly of high status. The other, younger, showed signs of violent death: bruised ribs, a broken collarbone, and possible strangulation. This wasn't coincidence. It was confirmation. In site after site, from Gokstad to Tissot, similar patterns emerged. Young women buried beside elite men, often with little personal decoration, but with evidence of trauma. Ritual knives, burned bedding, remains of herbal sedatives in their teeth. These weren't funerals. They were sacrificial orgies disguised as sacred duty. And the purpose was always the same: to channel energy. The Vikings believed that sexual energy could bridge worlds. That the act of penetration, forced or voluntary, could tear a hole between life and death, and send power across it. The girl became the rope in that transfer, pulled in both directions until she tore. They called her honored. But she was nothing more than tinder. This is the kind of history that doesn't survive in textbooks. It's too uncomfortable. Too damning. Too close to what we wish ancient civilizations were not. We like to remember the Vikings as adventurers, traders, shipbuilders. We forget they were also ritualists, myth-makers, and systematic violators of body and will in the name of gods and glory. The girl burned with her master wasn't alone in her fate. She was one of many. And each flame that rose into the sky carried the same unspoken truth. Power in Viking society was always taken, through steel, through sex, or through sacrifice. In Viking society, justice was not blind. It was theatrical, brutal, and laced with humiliation. And at its most disturbing, it became a performance, an eroticized ritual of punishment where sex and violence merged for public entertainment. The Norse didn't simply punish to correct. They punished to spectacle, to humiliate, to remind, to reinforce the iron grip of social order. And when it came to crimes tied to sexuality, real or perceived, the penalties were crafted with cruel precision. Public executions weren't enough. They had to be poetic. They had to fit the crime. And in Viking law, the worst offense wasn't theft or treason, it was sexual weakness. A man convicted of rape, for instance, didn't simply hang. In some regions he was subjected to public sexual assault himself, stripped naked, bound and violated with objects while crowds watched. Not to avenge the victim but to reverse roles. To make the aggressor become the submissive. In the eyes of the crowd, that reversal restored balance, not justice. In the saga of the Inklings, there are tales of castrations carried out in public squares, not with surgical detachment but as ritual degradation. The condemned man would be tied to a post, and his genitals removed with a dull blade while the crowd jeered. The removal of sexual power was symbolic. It stripped the man of his masculinity, his lineage, and his legacy. And the crowd? They celebrated. Because they weren't just witnessing punishment. They were part of it. This was justice as theater, and in the sagas, it became a genre of its own. Festivals across Scandinavia often included what the texts refer to as punishment tournaments. These weren't metaphorical contests. Captured enemies, criminals, and outcasts were brought forward, and crowds were encouraged to bet, not on whether they would live, but on how long they could endure sexualized forms of torture. One account from the saga of the Jomsvikings describes a ritual where a captive man, accused of betraying his clan, was forced to crawl naked through a gauntlet of sharpened stakes. But that wasn't the end. As he bled, he was tied face down and sodomized with a carved horn, a final act meant to defile his soul before death. There was a logic to this brutality, a structure, a message. To humiliate a man sexually was to unmake him, to reduce him to something less than human. This wasn't considered deviant. It was normalized, and in some cases celebrated. The line between punishment and pleasure blurred in ways modern minds struggle to comprehend. For Viking crowds, these events weren't shameful, they were exhilarating. The crowd became judge, jury, and witness to the undoing of a person's entire social identity. Women, too, were punished with sexual violence. An accused adulteress might be stripped, paraded, and assaulted before being stoned or drowned. But it wasn't always legal guilt that sealed their fate, it was community perception. A whisper was enough. A rumor. A badly timed glance. And once judgment began, there was no room for innocence. The psychological impact was total. A man who had been publicly raped or mutilated could not return to society. Not because he was rejected by law but because he was marked, ritually, visibly, and forever. Even if he lived, he no longer belonged. His masculinity had been revoked. His name erased. This was the function of Viking justice. Not rehabilitation. Not mercy. Erasure. By turning sexual punishment into entertainment, Viking culture ensured that its hierarchy stayed intact. The audience didn't just consume suffering, they participated in it. They laughed. They clapped. They taught their children to do the same. And so, the line between justice and cruelty disappeared. These rituals weren't hidden in shame. They were shouted in song, inscribed in law, celebrated in saga. Because to the Vikings, power wasn't just about winning. It was about watching someone else lose, in public, in flesh, and in front of everyone who mattered. In Viking society, sex was never just about desire. It was a hierarchy, a weapon, a declaration of status. And nowhere was this more apparent than in how the Norse viewed homosexuality, not as an identity but as a power structure. To be a man who had sex with other men was not shameful in itself. What mattered, what decided your honor, your fate, your legacy, was your role. If you penetrated, you were the victor. If you were penetrated, you were nothing. The sagas document warriors who kept both wives and male lovers. These relationships were not hidden or shunned. In fact, they were often celebrated so long as the man remained active. The dominant, the one who took, never received. It was not love that defined dishonor. It was submission. To be the one penetrated meant accepting a position culturally equivalent to slavery or defeat. It was to be conquered, owned, and worst of all, unmanly. This wasn't just social shame. It had legal implications. A man labeled as arger or ragger, suggesting he had taken the passive role, could be stripped of his rights. He could lose land, the ability to testify in court, even protection under the law. To be called passive was an insult so severe that under Icelandic law, murdering someone for saying it could be justified. But the Viking world was filled with contradictions. And the most powerful men in their mythology often crossed these very lines. Take Loki, the shapeshifter, the trickster, the agent of chaos. In one myth, Loki transforms into a mare and mates with a stallion, later giving birth to Odin's eight-legged horse, Sleipnir. It's a story often told with laughter. But beneath the comedy lies a truth the Vikings recognized and feared. The power to cross gender boundaries was dangerous. Unnatural. Magical. Then there's Odin, the Allfather himself, king of the gods. He practiced seer, a form of magic traditionally associated with women. It involved prophecy, illusion, and spiritual manipulation. Seer was powerful, but feminized, and for a man to use it was to violate gender expectations. The Prose Edda records other gods mocking Odin for this practice, calling his masculinity into question. Even he, the most powerful of all, was not safe from the Viking obsession with dominance and sexual role. And yet Odin's power only grew. Because in this paradox, the Vikings revealed their deepest fear, that true power might require crossing the very boundaries they enforced. Seer practitioners, often male outcasts, were seen as both sacred and repulsive, feared for their supernatural abilities, scorned for their perceived femininity. Their existence was tolerated only because of what they could do. This tension, between dominance and gender fluidity, power and submission, haunted Viking belief systems. They needed hierarchy. But their own gods kept breaking it. They worshipped warriors. But they whispered about witches. They enforced masculinity with violence. But their myths betrayed that power often came from places the law refused to recognize. In Viking society you were not judged for what you did, but for who you were while doing it. If you led, if you dominated, if you conquered, your actions were sacred. If you submitted, if you yielded, if you bent, your very existence was shame. Power was everything. And in the north, power flowed only in one direction. The Vikings are long dead. Their longhouses collapsed. Their ships rotted at sea. Their swords rusted into the earth. But their legacy, the violence, the hierarchy, the obsession with dominance, never left. It survives in ways we rarely recognize. Not just in museums or genetics, but in the laws we live under, the masculinity we idolize, and the stories we still whisper into the dark. Because Viking sexual violence didn't die with the Viking Age. It evolved. Modern legal systems still echo the cold logic of Norse law. In some parts of the world, a woman's virginity is still treated as a contract, her worth tied to blood on a bedsheet. In others, victims of sexual assault must still prove their resistance to be believed. The burden of honor remains heavy, just shifted to new language, new courts, new faces. But the roots are old. And northern. We inherited the idea that dominance equals virtue. That real men assert, conquer, take. That submission is weakness. That power flows in only one direction. These weren't just cultural quirks. They were institutional beliefs, shaped by centuries of ritual and reinforced by violence. The Vikings turned those beliefs into law, legend, and legacy. And they left behind more than scars. They left behind bloodlines. Modern DNA studies show Viking genes across Ireland, Scotland, England, Iceland, Greenland, and parts of Russia. In many places, entire populations carry fragments of Norse ancestry, descended not only from settlers and warriors but from victims. Women taken from their homes, trafficked across continents, forced into sexual servitude to forge alliances and breed loyalty. These bloodlines carry memory even if silent. The trauma doesn't vanish. It mutates. It hides in shame, in silence, in the stories that were never told. Even our folklore remembers, though we don't always see it. The noble warrior who can never show weakness. The shame of the man who's not man enough. The obsession with conquest, performance, and reputation. The need to prove dominance through sex, not love. These are not modern anxieties. They are ghosts in armor, whispering old rules in new tongues. In Old Norse culture, the worst thing a man could be called wasn't a liar, a thief, or even a coward. It was Arger, the unmanned, the one who submits. Today we use different words. But the contempt behind them remains the same. Our culture still punishes those who deviate from the script. Still mocks the gentle. Still shames the vulnerable. Still glorifies the aggressive. Still sees sex not as connection, but as currency. And in that, the Viking spirit endures. Not in the glory we mythologize, but in the shadow we refuse to confront. Their legacy is not just in sagas or ruins. It's in courtrooms, in locker rooms, in headlines, in how we teach boys to be men, in how we define strength, in how we erase the victims of domination and praise the ones who take without asking. Because the Vikings didn't just leave behind ships and swords. They left a blueprint, one built on blood, bound by shame, and held together by silence. Their violence outlived them, and it lives in us. If you've made it this far, you're not just a viewer. You're part of a rare few willing to face the side of history most won't even look at. So don't let this disappear into the algorithm. Like this video, share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to the History Scar, because the more of us there are, the harder it is for truth to be buried again. History doesn't heal if we hide it. And the scars don't fade if we pretend they were never there.